I want to start this deep dive by asking you, the listener, to put yourself in a highly uncomfortable scenario, like a genuinely stressful situation. If you only had 3 calendar days to patch a critical vulnerability on your perimeter, but you knew that applying that patch would permanently destroy the exact volatile memory forensics you need to know if you're already compromised, what do you do?
Yeah, that is, I mean, that's the ultimate catch-22. It's brutal.
Right. Do you patch and fly blind, or do you wait for the forensics and risk getting breached while your team is taking memory dumps?
And honestly, it is the defining operational dilemma for any security engineer today.
Yeah.
Because you are essentially trapped. You're pinned between these strict compliance mandates and actual rigorous incident response best practices.
Exactly. And the reason we are opening with that specific question is because, as of a few days ago, June 10th, 2026 to be exact, this is no longer just some theoretical tabletop exercise you do on a Friday afternoon. CISA just dropped their new Binding Operational Directive, BOD 2604.
And the shockwaves are massive. It is actively hitting every sector right now.
It really is. And to give some context on why this is happening now, I was just reading through the new 2026 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, the DBIR, that came out recently. And the numbers are, frankly, just alarming.
Oh yeah, the shift in initial access vectors is wild this year.
It is. Vulnerability exploitation has officially overtaken phishing. It's overtaken stolen credentials. It is now the leading initial access vector, sitting right at 31%.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, if you look at the research on enterprise remediation, our median time to actually fix these things has ballooned to 43 days.
43 days is, I mean, it's an absolute eternity when you look at the reality of how threat actors operate in 2026.
Yeah.
The DBIR numbers make perfect sense, honestly, when you factor in adversary automation. We are seeing threat groups leveraging these advanced AI models, tools like Claude Mythos, for instance, and they are actively ingesting raw GitHub commits, diffing the code, and weaponizing zero-day or end-day flaws into functional exploits in literally a matter of hours.
Hours, yeah. Hours versus 43 days.
The human response cycle simply cannot compete with that anymore. It's mathematically impossible.
And I really do feel for the security operations teams out there. Like, we need to have a massive amount of empathy for the practitioners listening to this right now, because they are burnt out, they are drowning in alerts, and now they are facing adversaries who are utilizing AI to scale their attacks. And all the while, enterprise management still expects them to maintain these completely unrealistic legacy patching SLAs.
It's exhausting just looking at those dashboards, let alone managing them.
Oh, absolutely. It is exhausting.
And the old way of doing vulnerability management is just fundamentally broken. It's not a secret anymore. This new CISA directive is essentially the U.S. federal government formally admitting on paper that the legacy process has collapsed.
Okay, so let's set the mission for today's deep dive. For the next hour, we are going to completely unpack this massive paradigm shift from CISA. We are exploring the evolution of the KEV catalog, the known exploited vulnerabilities list, and why we are witnessing the total death of relying solely on CVSS scores.
Long overdue, honestly.
Right. And then we'll examine the reality of predictive scoring with EPSS, and we will rigorously break down this brand new BOD 2604 framework. Because this framework forces federal agencies, and soon, by proxy, the rest of the industry, to patch the highest risk threats in just 3 calendar days, while formally giving you permission to defer the rest.
Which is a complete rewrite of how we prioritize cyber risk. I mean, a total teardown. But to truly understand why CISA felt compelled to take such a drastic, almost draconian step, we really have to look backward first.
Okay, where are we starting?
We have to analyze the system the entire industry has relied on for the better part of 2 decades.
You're talking about the common vulnerability scoring system, right? CVSS. I mean, it's the bedrock of traditional vulnerability management. It is hard-coded into every scanner, every SIM, every single GRC platform on the market today.
Exactly. CVSS. It's maintained by, first, the form of incident response and security teams, and it has been the dominant metric for how we quantify the severity of a software flaw. It outputs that familiar score from 0 to 10. Now, if you actually look under the hood, CVSS is mathematically derived from 3 distinct metric groups.
Right, the base metrics, the temporal metrics, and the environmental metrics. Let's actually unpack those, because I think a lot of security professionals, especially those sitting in management, they just see a 9.8 critical flashing in bright red on a dashboard and they immediately panic.
Oh yeah, full fire drill mode.
Yeah. They don't take a second to realize what that mathematical vector actually represents.
Spot on. So the base metrics are designed to measure the inherent, immutable characteristics of a vulnerability. It looks at the attack vector, meaning can this be exploited remotely over the internet, or does the attacker need to be physically standing in front of the server?
Okay.
It looks at attack complexity, whether the attacker requires user interaction or specific privileges, and ultimately what the impact is on the triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability.
Hmm.
These are static characteristics. Once first or a numbering authority calculates them, they generally do not change.
Okay, but then you have the temporal metrics, right? Which, at least in theory, try to capture the variables that do change over time. Things like, is there actual functional exploit code available in the wild? Or has the vendor released a patch or a temporary workaround?
Yes, exactly. And then finally, you have the environmental metrics. And these are supposed to allow an organization to adjust that static base score
Right.
depending on their specific architectural setup. For example, if the vulnerable system is deeply segmented on a restricted VLAN, or conversely, if it's an unprotected database housing highly regulated PHI or patient data, you tweak the score based on your environment.
But here's the critical failure point in the real world, and we all know this. Almost no one actually calculates the temporal or environmental scores.
It says it requires way too much manual context.
Exactly. It doesn't scale. If you have 10,000 vulnerabilities, you can't manually adjust the environmental context for every single one. So the industry, by and large, just imports the static base score provided by the National Vulnerability Database, the NVD, and treats it as an absolute, unquestionable truth.
And if you look at the research, that is a literal recipe for operational disaster when you confront the sheer volume of CVEs being minted today. I mean, we're seeing something like 25,000 to 30,000 new common vulnerabilities and exposures published every single year.
It's an unmanageable firehouse. And if you operate under the legacy service level agreements that most compliance frameworks demand, the expectation was that if a vulnerability hit a 7.0 or higher, meaning it's categorized as high or critical, you had a flat 30-day window to deploy a patch across your infrastructure.
Which is just wild when you say it out loud.
Wait, yeah, I've worked in enterprise IT.
Yeah.
And just doing the math on that, you literally cannot patch 15,000 high or critical vulnerabilities a year within strict 30-day windows. You would break every production system, every CI/CD pipeline, and every custom application in your enterprise.
The business would grind to a complete halt just for the downtime of rebooting servers.
Exactly. It's operationally dead.
Precisely. And this is the core of why CVSS fails defenders when it's used as a standalone prioritization tool. CVSS measures severity. It calculates how catastrophic the technical impact would be if the vulnerability is successfully exploited. But it does absolutely nothing to measure real-world risk or the actual probability of exploitability by threat actors.
Now, just to be fair to first here, because I know they get a lot of heat for this, the newer CVSS 4.0 standard does try to address some of this, right?
It does, yes.
They introduce automatable metrics, and they really tried to bake in more threat context. But I feel like even with 4.0, the base score still dominates vendor dashboards. The industry just hasn't pivoted away from the big red number.
They haven't. It's too ingrained in the psychology of risk management. And to illustrate why that's so dangerous, let's look at an architectural example. Imagine you have a vulnerability with a CVSS score of 9.8.
Okay, worst case scenario, basically.
Right. It's an unauthenticated remote code execution flaw. Technically, it is devastating, but that specific vulnerability exists on an internal air-gapped domain controller sitting in a locked server room that has zero internet routing.
Oh.
Now, contrast that with a vulnerability scoring a 5.5 searching, maybe it's an authorization bypass or a seemingly minor cross-site scripting flaw, but it exists on your public-facing, internet-exposed customer portal. And threat intelligence feeds show that ransomware affiliates are actively exploiting it in the wild right this second.
See, if I'm a vulnerability analyst just sorting my spreadsheet by CVSS score, my dashboard is literally screaming at me to drop everything and patch the 9.8 air-gapped system. Meanwhile, the 5.5 vulnerability is buried on page 4 of my weekly PDF report.
Exactly. CVSS alone dictates that you fix the 9.8 first, while attackers are quietly walking through your digital front door using the 5.5.
Wait, hold on though. Are you actually saying we should just ignore a CVSS 10? Because my GRC team, governance, risk, and compliance, they would have an absolute heart attack if I told them we aren't patching a 10 immediately. A 10 is maximum severity. It's a critical audit finding waiting to happen.
I get that pushback all the time. Think of it through a medical analogy. CVSS is like a hospital categorizing infectious diseases. Ebola is a 10. It is incredibly deadly. The severity is absolute maximum.
Right.
But if there is zero Ebola in your city, and simultaneously there is a massive outbreak of a level 5 influenza that is actively putting hundreds of people into the ICU, the emergency room doesn't start prepping for Ebola. They focus on the flu. CDSS tells you how deadly the virus is. It does not tell you if the virus is currently sitting in your waiting room coughing on people.
Oh, wow. That makes perfect sense. Severity does not equal imminent threat. A 9.8 in a lab doesn't matter if no one is actually using it. And, this realization that patching based on theoretical severity was fundamentally failing us is what perfectly bridges us into how the U.S. government decided to step in.
Yeah, they had enough.
CISA basically looked at the landscape and said, stop relying on theoretical math and start relying on ground truth evidence. And that philosophy is what birthed the KEV catalog.
Yes. Back in November of 2021, CISA issued Binding Operational Directive 2201. This was a monumental structural shift for the industry. It established the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog.
Right, the KEV.
The KEV. And it's crucial to understand that this wasn't just CISA publishing a list of suggestions or best practices. Because it was tied to a binding operational directive, BOD 2201 legally compelled all federal civilian executive branch agencies to remediate the specific vulnerabilities on that list within a hard time frame.
Which was what, initially?
Initially, they gave agencies 6 months to clean up older legacy flaws and a strict 14-day deadline to patch any newly discovered exploits added to the list.
But the KV isn't just a massive dump of every bad vulnerability researchers find on Twitter, right? If you read the foundational research on how the catalog is maintained, there are incredibly strict, methodical criteria for a vulnerability to actually make that list.
Very strict. It's built on a 3-pillar system.
Let's break those down. First, it absolutely must have a CVE ID formally assigned to it. You can't just throw a vague Windows RPC bug onto the KEV. It requires that unique IMIDERY identifier to track it.
Right. It needs cryptographic precision in how we identify it. We have to know exactly what we're talking about. And the second pillar is really the heart of the entire program. There must be reliable, confirmed evidence of active exploitation in the wild.
And active exploitation is a very heavily loaded term in this context. It's not just someone talking about a proof of concept on a dark web forum.
Exactly. The threshold is incredibly high.
Yeah.
Automated scanning activity does not count. Academic research doesn't count.
Even if it's published.
Even if it's published.
Yeah.
If a security researcher at a university builds a working proof of concept in an isolated lab and publishes a white paper on it, that does not count. Even if you see opportunistic botnets hitting external honeypots, that generally does not meet CISA's threshold.
So what does?
For a vulnerability to be added to the KEV, CISA must have undeniable evidence of a threat actor successfully executing malicious code against a real operational target without authorization. Has to be confirmed. Binary reality.
That is a massive operational distinction because the cybersecurity media, and we've all seen the headlines, they constantly report things as actively exploited when what they really mean is we see IP addresses actively scanning for it. Like, do you remember the Jenkins false alarm a while back?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
CVE 2024-23897.
Right. So for the audience, there was this path traversal vulnerability in Jenkins, which is a massively popular open source automation server. Suddenly, all the tech blogs and threat intel feeds were screaming that it was exploited in the wild.
Everyone was in full panic mode.
Total panic. Security engineering teams were ripping Jenkins instances offline, completely breaking their CI/CD deployment pipelines. But when the researchers at FIRST and CISA actually dug into the network traffic, they realized the proof of concept code out there was just reading the first few lines of the /etc/password file on Linux servers.
Which, as any intermediate Linux admin knows, the first few lines of that file don't even contain cryptographic password hashes anymore.
We know.
Those were moved to /etc/shadow decades ago. The password file just lists standard non-privileged system user accounts.
Exactly. It was just automated botnets blindly spraying the internet, running the exploit, just to see if the server would respond by coughing up 3 lines of a completely harmless file. It was reconnaissance. It was scanning. It was not true. Malicious exploitation leading to compromise.
Right.
So CISA held their ground and correctly refused to put it on the KV. And by doing so, they saved federal agencies and honestly anyone else watching the KV from having to declare a Sev 1 incident and disrupt their entire engineering workflow for what amounted to a false alarm.
Yeah. And that rigorous evidence-based verification is exactly what gives the KEV its immense authority in the industry. But it's also important to note that the process isn't always slow and methodical. When a real crisis hits, they can move with terrifying speed.
Oh, for sure.
Sometimes the evidence of exploitation is overwhelming, and the actual roadblock is the first pillar getting the CVE ID minted.
Oh, man. The ConnectWise speed run, we have to talk about that. That is a wild look at how the sausage gets made.
It really is a perfect case study. So earlier this year, CVE 2024-1709 hit ConnectWise Screen Connect. It was an authentication bypass vulnerability. It was absolutely brutal, and there was immediate, irrefutable incident response data showing that ransomware operators were actively compromising enterprise networks using it.
Okay.
But mysteriously, because of some administrative backlog, there was no official CVE ID assigned to the flaw yet.
Which means, based on their own rules, CISA couldn't legally put it on the KEV.
Right, and ConnectWise itself wasn't a CDE numbering authority or CNA at the time, so they couldn't just log into the portal and mint one themselves. The system was stalled.
So what did CISA do?
CISA, who is an authorized CNA, essentially bypassed the bureaucracy. They stepped in, minted a CVE ID in 3 minutes, resolved a system collision with Amiri, who was simultaneously trying to mint one, and had the vulnerability formally published, categorized, and injected onto the KEV catalog later that exact same day.
Wow.
It showed how incredibly agile the government machinery can actually be when the threat is critical.
That's a great example of bypassing red tape. Okay, so pillar 1 is the CVE ID. Pillar 2 is active, confirmed exploitation. What's the third pillar for the KEV?
Clear, actionable remediation guidance.
Right, because you can't just issue a federal mandate telling agencies, hey, your core router is on fire, we have no idea how to fix it, good luck meeting your 14-day SLA.
Exactly. Now, in 95% of cases, this remediation guidance simply points to a formal vendor badge. But not always. Sometimes the official remediation is a configuration workaround, like applying specific ingress firewall rules, disabling a vulnerable service protocol, or maybe changing a registry key.
Right.
And sometimes the remediation is completely nuclear,
Nuclear in what sense? Like turning it off?
in the sense of ripping the product out of your environment entirely. A classic historical example is when Adobe Flash Player reached its end of life. A massive zero-day vulnerability dropped CVE 2018-4878.
Oh, I remember that.
Because Adobe publicly stated there was never going to be a patch for it. CISA's official remediation guidance for adding it to the KEV was essentially disconnected, uninstall the binaries, and aggressively purge it from your enterprise architecture completely.
Okay, I mean, that makes total sense for something like a deprecated browser plugin like Flash. But what about severe edge cases? I'm thinking about industrial environments. What if there's an active exploit in, say, a critical ICS or SCADA environment? There's no patch available yet from the vendor, and turning the device off to mitigate the vulnerability would literally cause a kinetic disaster.
CISA is surprisingly pragmatic about the cyber-physical realm. Let's say the vulnerability is embedded in the logic controller for a major hydroelectric dam. If the only technical mitigation is shutting the controller off, but doing so forces the floodgates open and inundates a downstream town, CISA is obviously not going to recommend you turn it off.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, if there is no safe, non-destructive mitigation available, the vulnerability does not go on the KEV. Which, I admit, sounds counterintuitive to security purists. But you have to remember that the KEV is tied to a binding directive. If they put it on the list, federal agencies must execute the remediation by law. They cannot mandate a remediation that physically causes property damage or a loss of human life.
Okay, that context really helps. So we've established that the KV catalog is fantastic because it is deterministic. It is binary confirmed ground truth evidence. The tornado is actually on the ground. But logically, it is, by definition, a reactive tool. You essentially have to wait for some unfortunate organization to get breached for CISA to gather the evidence to warn the rest of us.
Right. Someone has to be patient zero.
Exactly. And if I'm a proactive defender, I want to know what to patch before the attacker weaponizes it. I want to patch the thing before it ever hits the KEV.
And that operational desire is exactly what brings us to EPSS, the Exploit Prediction Scoring System. Like CVSS, EPSS is also managed by the researchers at first. But instead of trying to measure static technical severity, EPSS outputs a dynamic probability.
Okay.
It gives you a mathematical score from 0 to 1, which you can read as a 0 to 100% probability that a specific CVE will see active exploitation in the wild within the next 30 days.
And it calculates this using machine learning models, right? I was reading the research documentation, and it says the model ingests something crazy, like over 1,100 distinct variables daily.
It does. It uses a highly complex logistic regression model. It looks at the age of the vulnerability, the specific vendor track record, whether functional proof of concept code has been published to GitHub or exploit.db.
Wow.
It looks at whether the exploit has been weaponized into offensive security tools like Metasploit or Cobalt Strike. It even analyzes historical exploitation patterns of similar architectures. So theoretically, you have a perfect triad CVSS evaluating theoretical severity, the KEV catalog confirming past reality, and EPSS offering forward-leaning predictive probability.
Right, theoretically. And this is where the research gets really interesting. Vulnerability management teams have increasingly been treating EPSS as this magical, flawless early warning system, like a crystal ball that tells them exactly what to patch. But the recent empirical research published by Nucleus Security throws some serious cold water on that assumption, doesn't it?
It throws freezing water on it. Nucleus Security did a massive data analysis on how EPSS scores actually behaved chronologically around the exact time a vulnerability was formally added to the KEV catalog.
And what did they find?
What they discovered was fascinating. They found that EPSS scores shifted 121 times more dynamically after a vulnerability hit the KEV catalog than they did in the weeks prior.
Wait a minute. Think about what you just said. If the prediction score spikes after the event has already demonstrably happened, that's not a prediction at all. That's just an observation of reality.
Exactly. And the reason for this comes down to how the machine learning model is architected. EPSS actually treats a CISA KV listing as an input variable for its own model, rather than just treating it as the ground truth output it's trying to predict.
I see.
So when CISA publicly announces, hey, we have cryptographic proof this is being exploited, the EPSS model dynamically ingests that new data point.
Mm-hmm.
And because KV is such a heavily weighted variable, it creates this massive artificial spike in the EPSS probability score within 72 hours after the CISA listing.
So if I can try to put an analogy on this, EPSS is essentially the local weather forecaster saying there's an 80% chance of a tornado today based on atmospheric pressure. But the KEV catalog is the actual physical tornado siren going off because a train spotter just saw the funnel cloud destroying a barn.
That's a very accurate analogy.
Mm-hmm.
And what the nucleus security research essentially proves is that the local weatherman is very often updating his forecast model to say 99% chance of tornadoes only after he hears the siren blaring outside his window.
Okay, but if EPSS has this inherent statistical lag, how do mature security operations centers, the SOC teams that are actually doing this well, how do they use these two tools together? Do they just throw EPSS out?
No, you definitely don't throw it out. You layer them systematically. The KEV catalog is your hard, non-negotiable override. It is deterministic. If a CVE is on the KEV, you drop whatever project you're working on, you page the engineers, and you fix it because the tornado is actively on the ground.
Right.
But remember the math from earlier. We have 30,000 CVEs a year, and only a tiny fraction of them ever make it to the KEV. So for the massive backlog of tens of thousands of vulnerabilities that aren't on the KE, you use EPSS to stack rank them. It's probabilistic. It helps your infrastructure teams logically decide what needs to be patched this Tuesday versus what can safely wait until the scheduled quarterly maintenance window.
Okay, let's synthesize this. We've firmly established that the legacy CVSS-only approach is failing us because severity doesn't equal risk. The KEV catalog stepped in and gave us a verifiable list of confirmed fires. But if we look back at the old rules under BOD 2201, there was still a massive flaw. Every KEV was treated equally.
Yes, exactly.
A KE vulnerability sitting on an isolated, air-gapped internal server carried the exact same 14-day legal deadline as a KEV vulnerability sitting on an internet-facing public web server. And with AI massively accelerating how fast attackers automate their exploit chains, a 14-day SLA is disastrously too slow for your internet-facing perimeter, while simultaneously being a complete waste of engineering resources for your internal protected assets.
Which perfectly brings us to the massive paradigm shift that just happened on June 10th, 2026. CIA looked at this operational data, realized human speed patching was failing, realized attackers were outpacing the 14-day SLA, and they completely fundamentally rewrote the rules of engagement.
Enter BOD 2604.
Yes. BOD 2604. First off, it completely and officially revokes BOD 2201, which was the original KE rule. It also goes a step further and revokes BOD 1902, which was a much older, outdated directive regarding patching internet-accessible systems.
So it cleans house.
It cleans house, it takes both of those legacy rules and replaces them with a highly targeted, dynamically risk-tiered prioritization framework built entirely on the SSVC decision tree.
SSVC. For the listeners who haven't dug into the CISA documentation yet, that stands for Stakeholder-Specific Vulnerability Categorization, correct? I know it was originally researched and developed by CISA in partnership with the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon.
That's the one. And its most radical feature is that it abandons CVSS entirely for federal prioritization mandates. It doesn't look at base scores at all. Instead, it demands that every single vulnerability instance be evaluated against 4 distinct contextual variables.
Okay, this is where the rubber meets the road. Let's really break down the mechanics of these 4 variables because this is what engineers are going to be living and breathing. What is variable number 1?
Variable number 1 is asset exposure. Simply put, is the specific vulnerable system logically reachable by unauthenticated or untrusted entities over a public network like the internet? This is arguably the most critical variable, and it's also the hardest, because this is the only variable that the federal agency or your private enterprise has to continuously figure out for themselves. CISA cannot dynamically map your internal network architecture or your firewall rules.
Right, this comes down to attack surface management. I have to intimately know what assets I have exposed to the internet. If I don't know my own attack surface, the whole tree fails. What's variable number 2?
Number 2 is straightforward KEV status. Is the CVE currently listed on the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog? It's binary. Yes or no?
Okay, so exposure and KEV. What is variable 3?
Variable 3 is exploit automation. This looks at the mechanics of the exploit itself. Can an adversary reliably automate every single step of the attack chain? Meaning, can they write a script that automates the reconnaissance, the weaponization, the payload delivery, and the exploitation without any human interaction required?
So a worm.
Exactly. If the answer is yes, it means the vulnerability is wormable, or it can be easily integrated into massive, distributed scanning botnets. It means the attack scales infinitely.
Which is terrifying, especially when you factor in those AI tools we mentioned earlier generating the exploit code. And the final, 4th variable.
The 4th is technical impact. This is a narrowed down look at severity. Does successful exploitation grant the attacker total control, meaning they achieve arbitrary remote code execution, or they steal root administrative credentials? Or does it only grant partial control, which might be a temporary denial of service attack, limited data exposure, or localized resource starvation?
So to summarize, the tree S: exposure, case status, exploit automation, and technical impact. But wait, I'm putting my SOC manager hat on right now. If I have a lean team of analysts and you're telling me they have to manually research and evaluate 30,000 CVEs a year against those last 3 variables, hunting down exploit patterns to test automation, reading vendor advisories to determine technical impact, my analysts are going to quit. The cognitive load is impossible.
And CISA recognized that exact operational bottleneck. That's the absolute genius of their rollout plan. They knew you couldn't do this manually, so they simultaneously launched the Vulnerrichment program to do the heavy lifting for the entire industry.
Enrichment. It's a great name. How does it actually function under the hood?
CISA is now formally acting as an authorized data publisher, or ADP, within the MITRE CVE ecosystem. What they are doing is taking a dedicated team of federal analysts, evaluating every new CVE against those SSVC variables, cabinet status, automation feasibility, and technical impact, and injecting those exact data points directly into the ADP container of the standard JSON CVE 5.0 schema.
And just thinking about how that JSON data gets ingested, because JSON is the native format for almost all enterprise tooling, this means your vulnerability scanners like Tenable or Qualys, your SIM platforms like Splunk, your SAR orchestration tools, they can all pull down this enriched CISA threat metadata automatically via API.
Completely automatically.
You don't need a team of human analysts reading PDF vulnerability write-ups. The contextual data is just natively embedded in the vulnerability feed. All your internal team has to do is map that enriched data against variable 1, your own internal asset exposure mapping.
Exactly. It's automated context delivery. So to really put the impact of this into perspective, let's contrast this with the old rules. Under the legacy BOD 2201, if a vulnerability hit the KEV, you had 14 days to patch it. It was a flat mandate. It didn't matter if it was on a public web server or a printer on an isolated subnet. How does the new BOD 2604 treat that same scenario?
Yeah, how does it?
BOD 2604 functions as a dynamic decision tree, not a static checklist. It mathematically rides the vulnerability through those 4 variables to assign it to one of 5 distinct remediation tiers. It treats a KEV vulnerability sitting on an internal, non-automatable asset very, very differently than a KEV vulnerability on a public-facing automatable asset.
Wait, let me make sure I'm hearing this right. Is CISA actually giving federal agencies, and by extension the industry, explicit permission to not patch things immediately?
They absolutely are. And this is a massive psychological shift for GRC teams. There's a formal deferral tier called Fix on Next System Upgrade.
Wow.
Yeah, if a vulnerability routes through the SSVC tree and fails to meet the active risk criteria, for example, it's not on the KV, it's not automatable, it only yields partial control, and the asset has no internet exposure. Agencies have formal documented permission to defer remediation entirely. You don't have to break your back patching it in 30 days. You can simply wait until the next naturally scheduled major application upgrade or hardware lifecycle refresh.
I cannot overstate how massive that is for combating organizational patch fatigue. I saw a piece of the CISA research indicating that during an initial pilot analysis of a large federal agency's environment, something like 60% of their total vulnerability instances successfully routed to that deferral tier under this new model.
60%. Think about the resource allocation shift there. Imagine freeing up 60% of your infrastructure team's patching bandwidth. It legally allows security teams to stop chasing theoretical severity scores that pose no immediate risk and refocus all of their human capital on fighting actual burning fires.
And this is but for that 1% of top tier fires, the ones that route to the very top of the tree, the new rules are incredibly brutal, aren't they?
Brutal is exactly the right word, because when all the variables align and you hit the highest risk path on that SSVC decision tree, the timeline absolutely collapses.
So what are these 5 new remediation tiers, from least to most critical?
Starting from the bottom, you have the Fix on Next Upgrade deferral tier, which we just discussed. Moving up, you have a 60-day window for low-risk external or medium-risk internal flaws. Then a 14-day window. Then a highly accelerated standard 3-day window. And finally, sitting at the absolute top of the matrix, the P0 tier 3 days plus mandatory forensic triage.
Okay, we need to dive deep into that P0 top tier because this is what's keeping CISOs awake at night right now, 3 calendar days. When exactly is this nightmare scenario triggered?
This tier is triggered when all 4 of the worst-case variables align perfectly. The vulnerability has been confirmed on the KVV catalog. The exploit grants total technical control of the system, the attack chain is fully automatable, and the vulnerable asset is publicly exposed to the internet.
Exposed, actively exploited, fully automatable, and granting total system control. That is basically the 4 horsemen of a ransomware event.
Exactly. If you have that specific combination, CISA mandates that you remediate the vulnerability within 72 hours of discovery. But here's the kicker. It is not just a patching mandate. The directive explicitly states you must also conduct formal forensic triage on the asset.
And this brings up what the incident response research specifically calls the forensic sequencing dilemma. I want you to explain the mechanics of this because the operational tension here is fascinating, and I think a lot of IT teams don't fully grasp the trap they are walking into.
It's a massive trap. Consider the variables. You have an internet-facing asset, and there is a fully automatable exploit actively circulating in the wild that grants total, unauthenticated control of the system. If your vulnerability scanner is just now alerting you to this fact today, there is a staggering mathematical probability that you are already compromised. The threat actors are moving in hours using AI automation. You are reacting in days.
Right, so if I just rush in, open a change ticket, and slap the vendor patch on the server, I might be locking the front door, but the attacker is already sitting on my couch establishing persistence.
It is actually worse than that. By blindly locking the front door with a patch, you might be permanently destroying the only forensic evidence that could prove they were ever on the couch in the first place.
If we think about this like a physical crime scene, deploying a patch without taking memory dumps is like the police coming in and vigorously bleaching the entire crime scene to make it safe before the homicide detectives have even had a chance to dust for fingerprints. When you apply an enterprise patch, it is inherently a destructive act to the operating system. It often forces a hard reboot. It aggressively overwrites registry keys, it clears active web cache directories, and crucially, it completely erases volatile RAM.
And volatile RAM is exactly where modern sophisticated threat actors operate. It's where fileless malware processes reside. It's where unencrypted session tokens and attacker command and control connection logs are temporarily stored. If your IT team just blindly deploys the patch to meet the 72-hour SLA, they wipe the RAM, and they completely blind your incident response team. You will never know if data was exfiltrated.
So you have this agonizing, crushing operational tension. The federal mandate gives you exactly 72 hours, 3 calendar days to deploy the patch to stop the active bleeding. But before you are allowed to deploy that patch, your security team must intervene, preserve the volatile memory, capture network PCKPs, and grab attacker artifacts to determine if it's already an active breach.
It requires a strict, flawlessly orchestrated, phase-bound sequence of events. First, containment and memory capture. Second, forensic analysis. Third, patching and remediation. And you have to execute that entire sequence flawlessly across departmental silos under extreme 72-hour time pressure.
I have to be honest, I'm going to push back heavily on the realism of this. I've worked in massive enterprise environments. Mandating a 3 calendar day turnaround for the federal government or any Fortune 500 company to orchestrate cross-departmental memory forensics, analyze the results, and then safely deploy a patch to a critical revenue-generating public server. That is completely disconnected from the reality of enterprise IT.
You're not wrong about how hard it is.
By the time the Change Advisory Board even meets to review the ticket, it's day 4. This feels like an automation mandate wearing a compliance costume.
An automation mandate wearing a compliance costume, that is the absolute perfect way to phrase it.
Yeah.
CISA knows exactly what they're doing here. They're forcing the issue. If your organization's remediation process still relies on an analyst manually opening a JIRA ticket, routing it to a system administrator, taking it to a weekly manual change approval board meeting, and then waiting for a scheduled weekend maintenance window, you have lost the war before you've even started.
You're already breached.
Right. The 72 hours will expire before the ticket is even assigned to an engineer. The subtext of BOD 2604 is that you must completely automate your asset discovery, your memory forensics, and your patch deployment pipelines.
And the really terrifying part for GRC teams is that these deadlines are highly dynamic, right? They change the moment the environmental facts change.
Yes, the SSVC tree recalculates constantly. Let's say you have a vulnerability on an internal human resources database. It routes to a 60-day remediation window because it has no internet exposure. But then, on a Friday night, a junior network engineer makes a configuration mistake and accidentally opens an ingress firewall rule, exposing that specific database to the public internet.
Oh, no.
The SSVC variables instantly shift. That 60-day vulnerability mathematically transforms into a 3-day P0 emergency overnight. The clock violently recalculates.
Or conversely, let's say you have a 3-day P0 emergency on a web server, and the forensics team says, we need a week to analyze this RAM dump. You can just virtually yank the network cable, take the system offline, and because the exposure variable changes to 0, your compliance clock instantly relaxes, buying the IR team the time they need.
Exactly. Taking a system offline or severing its public routing is a recognized valid mitigation strategy under BOD 2604, specifically to buy your forensic team more time to investigate.
Okay, so CISA is legally demanding this unprecedented 3-day turnaround. But realistically, for CISA to enforce a 3-day clock, CISA themselves have to be incredibly fast at identifying these exploits in the wild. They can't take 3 weeks to privately validate an exploit and add it to the KEV or the whole accelerated system falls apart. How did they solve their own internal validation bottleneck?
They realized very quickly that they couldn't do it alone using closed-door government intelligence. Historically, CISA had to privately validate in the wild exploitation. They relied heavily on data from federal network honeypots, or they triaged manual unstructured emails sent to their vulnerability intake inboxes.
Which is super slow.
Very slow. It was a bureaucratic process that essentially made the KEV catalog a trailing indicator. They were warning enterprise defenders days or even weeks after the automated scanners had already started compromising networks.
So what changed structurally? How did they speed it up?
They weaponized the global cybersecurity community's intelligence. CISA launched a brand new centralized KV nomination form, which is deeply integrated with their overarching Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure Program, or CVD.
So anyone, literally anyone, can just nominate a vulnerability to be added to the federal KEV list?
Yes, but to be clear, it's not just a web suggestion box where you type, I think this is bad. It is a highly structured, rigorous intake pipeline. Independent red team researchers, commercial security vendors, frontline incident responders, they can now submit concrete cryptographic evidence, network PCCAFs, memory dumps, and verified indicators of compromise directly to CISA's analyst teams through this secure portal.
So basically, CISA is effectively turning the entire global InfoSec community, every independent researcher and SOC analyst, into their own massively distributed intelligence network to find exploits faster.
That is exactly the architecture they are building, and it aligns perfectly with the mandate of the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the JCDC, whose explicit foundational goal is rapid, multi-directional information sharing between the public and private sectors. Instead of CISA analysts blindly hunting for the evidence in the dark, the community actively feeds the evidence to CISA in the exact architectural format CISA needs to validate it instantly.
And just thinking about the mechanics of that, it must compress CISA's internal validation lifecycle from weeks to mere hours. Imagine an independent red team researcher finds an active zero-day exploit being used against a major enterprise firewall appliance. Under the old system, they email the vendor stalls, tries to manage the PR fallout, denies it's a zero
Yeah,
day.
we see that all the time.
All the time. But now the researcher bypasses the vendor entirely. They use the KEV nomination form. They upload the PC key definitively showing the active exploit. CISA's technical team validates the packet capture, drops the CVE onto the KEV catalog, and boom, every single federal agency is instantly legally mandated to a 3-day clock to patch a vulnerability that the software vendor hasn't even publicly acknowledged yet.
It is an incredibly powerful lever. It completely strips away what we call the maturity mirage of legacy software vendors who historically try to quietly delay patches to manage their quarterly PR metrics. When an independent researcher submits undeniable cryptographic evidence of exploitation directly to the federal government, it instantly puts immense, highly public pressure on the software vendor to radically accelerate their disclosure and patching timelines. They can't hide behind NDAs anymore.
Okay, so this is a massive operational shift in power dynamics, but I want to pivot here because so far we've technically only been talking about federal civilian agencies, the FCEB. If I'm listening to this deep dive right now, and I'm a security architect at a private retail company or a regional hospital network or a mid-sized financial institution, why do I actually care about an internal binding directive meant for federal government agencies? CISA doesn't regulate me.
You care because of the regulatory ripple effect. It's true, BOD 2604 only legally binds the federal government. But the moment the United States federal government formally declares that legacy patching based on severity CVSS scores is broken, and formally declares that a 3-day clock for KV-listed threats is the new baseline standard for reasonable security, that standard instantly, irreversibly infects the entire private sector ecosystem.
So if I'm a private enterprise CISO, I can't just ignore BOD 2604 and stick to my 30-day SLAs.
You ignore it at your own absolute peril. Because while CISA won't ever audit a private retail company, your private third-party auditors absolutely will. When external assessors are determining what legally constitutes commercially reasonable security practices during a post-breach lawsuit, they look to federal benchmarks as the gold standard. And honestly, it's not just the auditors you need to worry about, it's the cyber insurers.
Oh, the cyber insurance markets. They are absolutely ruthless right now with their underwriting requirements.
They have to be. Their loss ratios are terrible. And I guarantee you, within 1 or 2 policy renewal cycles, every single cyber insurance underwriting questionnaire is going to explicitly ask, do you actively utilize the CISA KV catalog? Do you prioritize your patching based on SSVC variables? Can your organization reliably remediate critical, exploited, public-facing vulnerabilities within 72 hours?
And if you say no,
If your GRC team checks the box that says, no, our median remediation time is 43 days based on CVSS, your premiums are going to skyrocket exponentially. Or you are simply going to be denied coverage entirely because you are mathematically uninsurable.
and what about the internal pressure? What about boards of directors?
It's the exact same dynamic. A corporate board member is going to read an article in the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times. They're going to see that the federal government now mandates a 3-day patch window for critical internet-facing threats. And they are going to turn around in the next committee meeting, look at their CISO, and say, why does our enterprise policy still say 30 days? Are we operating less securely than the DMV? It instantly transforms from a technical debate into a massive corporate governance issue.
But the ripple effect isn't just informal audit pressure or insurance questionnaires. I was reading through the research, and in some highly regulated industry sectors, the KEV catalog is actually being aggressively written into hard compliance rules. We really need to talk about the medical device industry here because the implications are staggering.
Yes, the FDA. This is arguably the most perfect example of how the KEV catalog is rapidly becoming law by proxy. Under Section 524B of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDA issued their final pre-market cybersecurity guidance back on February 3, 2026.
And how does a food and drug regulation tie into a CISA vulnerability catalog?
The FDA regulation explicitly requires medical device manufacturers to maintain a highly robust, continuous post-market monitoring program. The days of shipping a connected pacemaker, an insulin pump, or a network-attached MRI machine and just forgetting about the software stack are over.
Thank goodness.
Right. You have to continuously monitor for emerging vulnerabilities in the device's code, and FDA reviewers now explicitly expect that post-market monitoring program to legally include exploit availability signals. And what is the canonical, federally recognized source for exploit availability?
The CISA KV catalog.
Exactly. And this introduces the incredibly critical and often misunderstood role of VEX statements, vulnerability exploitability exchange documents.
Let's really unpack VEX because this is where the engineering complexity skyrockets. Because a modern medical device, let's say an MRI machine running a custom Linux kernel, might have a software bill of materials, an SB-bomb, that contains literally thousands of open source libraries and third-party dependencies in it.
Right. It's a massive software supply chain tree. And let's say one of those deep open source components, maybe a logging library like Log4j, has a vulnerability that eventually gets listed on the CISA KV catalog. The device manufacturer is now instantly on the federal clock. Now, here is the catch. Even if that specific vulnerable code path within the logging library isn't actually reachable or executable in the specific lockdown way the medical device is configured, the manufacturer cannot just ignore the KEV listing. They must formally produce a VEX statement documenting their technical position.
Wait, so they have to mathematically prove and thoroughly document why the MRI machine isn't affected using static analysis or control flow graphs rather than just internally saying, we don't call that function and moving on.
Precisely. The burden of proof shifts entirely to the manufacturer, and this requirement is actively creating a massive deficiency letter pattern in FDA submissions right now. Picture this scenario. A medtech startup submits their revolutionary new connected device for MTA market clearance. As required, they hand over their massive machine-readable SBOM. The FDA reviewer takes that SBOM and programmatically cross-references every single component against the CISA KV catalog. The reviewer sees a KEV-listed CVE deep in the software stack, but the startup failed to provide a VX statement mathematically explaining their mitigation or unreachability status.
What happens to the startup?
The FDA reviewer immediately kicks the entire submission back as a formal cybersecurity deficiency. The multi-million-dollar market clearance is completely halted. The product launch is delayed by 6 months. So even though BOD 2604 is technically a federal civilian directive, the reality is if you want to legally sell a medical device in the United States today, your engineering teams better be aggressively cross-referencing your device SBOMs against the KEV catalog every single day and generating VX statements, or you won't survive the regulatory process.
Man, this all paints a very intense, almost overwhelming picture of where the entire discipline of vulnerability management is heading. It really feels like we are violently exiting the era of best effort, scan and patch security, and we are entering a much harsher era of evidence-based automated enforcement.
We are. The historical grace period is officially over. The U.S. government, by releasing BOD 2604, has formally concluded that human speed patching based on theoretical severity scores simply cannot keep pace with AI-accelerated exploitation. Evidence-based prioritization using the KEV and SSVC paired with highly automated forensic and patching execution pipelines is genuinely the only viable path forward for network defenders.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what does this actually mean for the daily life of the security professional, the GRC analyst, or the cloud architect listening right now? What should they do tomorrow morning?
It means you need to fundamentally rethink your internal workflows. You need to map your current legacy enterprise patch policies to these new 4 SSVC outcome tiers. You need to ask yourself a very uncomfortable question: can you definitively architecturally prove which of your specific enterprise assets are publicly exposed to the internet at any given moment? Because if you can't automatically prove they are internal, BOD 2604 assumes by default that they are exposed, and you inherit the strictest SLAs.
That's a huge burden.
It is. You must automate everything beneath the judgment line, all those low and medium risk patches that you now have permission to defer or automate. So your human analysts actually have the cognitive bandwidth to handle the complex memory forensics on that critical 1% that triggers the 72-hour P0 clock.
It's a massive pivot. It's about moving away from the impossible task of patching everything perfectly to strategically patching less, but patching the right things much, much faster.
Exactly. It's about focusing your human capital where the actual fire is.
Well said. We have covered a massive paradigm shift today, moving away from the theoretical CVSS monolith, embracing the binary evidence-based reality of the KEV catalog, understanding how to layer in the probabilistic forecasts of EPS without getting tricked by the model lag, and ultimately navigating the brutal reality of the SSVC decision tree and BOD 2604's 72-hour forensic clock.
It's a lot to take in, but it's the new reality.
It really is. All right, everyone, that is all the time we have today. Thanks for tuning into InfoSec Bytes. Keep exploring our 100-plus episodes on information security, AI, cloud, quantum, and cybersecurity incident root cause analysis. Please like, subscribe. We are on various platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Music, and share to stay connected and keep your cyber defenses strong. See you in the next episode. Stay tuned.
Take care, everyone.
Oh, and before you go, here's something to research and think about for your own environment this week. If CISA called you today and said your most critical revenue-generating public-facing server had a KEV-listed vulnerability, do you actually have the automation pipelines in place to capture volatile forensic memory and deploy a patch within 72 hours? Or would your change approval board still be debating the JIRA ticket on day 4? Think about it.